Frank Carson dropped to his knees in the middle of his dead wheat field and let out a sound no man should ever make. 40 acres of brittle stalks crumbled between his fingers like broken promises. Every seed he'd planted last fall bad. Every dollar he'd saved gone. The bank notice in his pocket gave him 4 months to pay a debt he couldn't touch. But 40 miles away, a widow named Ethel Mitchell was staring at 3 barrels of her late husband's golden seed and making a choice that would change everything. If you want to see how one woman's generosity saved a proud man's soul, subscribe to our channel and stay until the very end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's begin. Frank Carson hadn't cried since he was 14 years old. Not when his parents died. Not when the drought of '71 took half his cattle. Not when he spent Christmas alone for the 10th year in a row. But standing in that field at dawn, watching the sun rise over 40 acres of nothing, something cracked open inside him. He pulled a brittle stalk from the ground. It snapped like kindling. "Damn you," he whispered. "Damn you to hell." He walked the rows anyway. Every single one. His boots kicked up dust where green shoots should have been. The seed he'd bought last fall from that trader passing through bad. Every kernel. And he'd been too proud, too stubborn, too sure of himself to test it before planting. Now he had nothing. Frank stopped at the edge of his property and stared at the empty granary. His father had built that structure 40 years ago. 3 large barrels stood inside, scrubbed clean, waiting for a harvest that would never come. He pulled the bank notice from his shirt pocket. He'd memorized every word, but he read it again anyway. Payment due in 4 months. 4 months. He crushed the paper in his fist and shoved it back in his pocket. "All right," he said to no one. "All right then." The ride to town took 2 hours. Frank used every minute to rehearse what he'd say to the cattle broker. Calm, reasonable, not desperate. He wasn't desperate. He was just a man selling his cattle early, that's all. Happened all the time. Nothing unusual about it. The lie sat heavy in his chest. Miller's Creek wasn't much of a town general store, feed shop, church, saloon, and a handful of houses clustered around a dusty main street. Frank had lived 30 miles from here for 13 years and still felt like an outsider. That was fine. He preferred it that way. Tom Bradley was sweeping the porch of the feed store when Frank rode up. He stopped sweeping and leaned on his broom, watching Frank dismount. "Morning, Frank." "Tom?" "Heard about your fields." Tom's voice carried that particular tone, sympathy wrapped in curiosity. "Bad seed, folks are saying." Frank tied his horse to the post. "Folks say a lot of things." "They do." Tom waited a beat. "You hear about the cattle?" "I'm here to see Harrison about selling early." Tom whistled low. "Selling early. That's rough, Frank. You'll get half what they're worth." "I know what I'll get." "I'm just saying." "I know what I'll get, Tom." Tom held up his hands. All right. Harrison's inside. Just finished with the Dawson brothers." Frank nodded once and walked past him into the feed store. The smell hit him, first grain and leather, and the particular mustiness of a building that had seen too many seasons. Harrison Cobb sat behind the counter, a thick ledger open in front of him. He looked up when Frank entered. "Frank Carson." Harrison didn't smile. He never smiled. "What can I do for you?" "I need to sell my cattle." "All of them." "All of them." Harrison studied him for a long moment. His eyes were small and calculating, the eyes of a man who'd made his living on other people's misfortune. "Heard about your crop," Harrison said finally. "Everyone's heard about my crop." "Bad luck." "Bad seed." Harrison nodded slowly. "Well, I can take the cattle off your hands. 20 head, is it?" 22. 22. Harrison pulled a pencil from behind his ear and made a note. "I can give you $8 a head." Frank felt his jaw tighten. "They're worth 15. They're worth 15 at auction in fall. You want to sell now in spring when everyone's buying, not selling?" Harrison shrugged. $8. 10. 8. Frank's hands curled into fists at his sides. $8 a head. $176 for 22 head of cattle he'd raised from calves. It wouldn't cover his debt, wouldn't even come close. "I'll think about it," Frank said. "You do that." Harrison went back to his ledger. "Offer stands until Friday." Frank walked out of the feed store without another word. He stood on the porch, staring at nothing, trying to calculate figures that wouldn't add up no matter how he arranged them. Sell the cattle, buy cheap seed, plant late, pray for a miracle. It wasn't a plan. It was desperation dressed up in work clothes. Frank Carson. He turned. A woman stood at the bottom of the steps, middle-aged, maybe 35, with dark hair pinned back and eyes that looked like they'd seen their share of sorrow. She wore a simple dress, practical boots, and carried herself like someone who knew hard work. "I'm Frank Carson." "I'm Margaret Wilson, from the Mitchell Ranch out past Cutter's Ridge." Frank didn't know her, didn't know any Mitchells either. "Ma'am?" "I heard about your crop." She climbed the steps and stood beside him, looking out at the dusty street. "Whole town's talking about it." "Whole town's got too much time on their hands." Margaret laughed, a short, surprised sound. "That they do." She paused. "I came to town with my neighbor, Ethel Mitchell. She's James Mitchell's widow." The name meant nothing to Frank. "James Mitchell was the best seed breeder in the territory," Margaret continued. "Spent 15 years developing a strain of wheat that could survive anything, drought, frost, you name it. Farmers came from 100 miles to buy his seed. Good for him. He died last winter. Pneumonia." Margaret's voice softened. "Left Ethel alone with 3 barrels of the finest seed grain you ever saw." Frank turned to look at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Ethel heard about your situation and she's got a mind to help." Frank's back stiffened. "I don't need help." "Didn't say you did." Margaret smiled, but there was something sharp in it. "I just said she's got a mind to. What you do about it is your business." She walked down the steps and disappeared into the general store. Frank stood there for a long moment, her words turning over in his mind. Help. He didn't take help, didn't ask for it, didn't accept it, didn't need it. He'd built his ranch with his own 2 hands, raised his cattle, planted his fields, done everything himself because that was how a man proved his worth. Taking help was admitting failure, and Frank Carson didn't fail. He rode home the long way, following the creek where cottonwoods grew thick and green. The water was low, drought year coming, anyone could see it, but the trees didn't care. They dug their roots deep and found what they needed. Frank wished he could do the same. The ranch looked different when he rode in, smaller somehow. The house needed new shingles. The fence by the south pasture sagged. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. All things he'd been meaning to fix after harvest. There wouldn't be a harvest. He unsaddled his horse and brushed him down, taking his time. Physical work had always steadied him. The rhythm of it, the simplicity. A brush stroke, then another. No thinking required. When he finished, he walked to the granary and stood in the doorway. Empty. 3 barrels scrubbed clean, waiting. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "A full granary means you've done right by the land, son. An empty one means you've got work to do." "I've got nothing but work," Frank said aloud, "and nothing to show for it." He turned away and went inside to make supper. The next morning, a rider appeared on the road. Frank saw the dust cloud first, then the figure on horseback. He was in the barn mending a harness that didn't really need mending when the hoofbeats reached him. He set down the leather and walked outside. A woman reined in her horse by the water trough. The same woman from town? No, not the same. This one was younger, with dark hair and eyes that assessed him with unsettling directness. "Mr. Carson." "That's right. I'm Ethel Mitchell." She dismounted with the ease of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. "I believe you met my friend Margaret yesterday." Frank's jaw tightened. "I did." Then you know why I'm here. Ma'am, I appreciate whatever kindness you're thinking of offering, but I don't— Don't what? She cut him off, her voice firm. Don't accept help. Don't take charity. Don't let anyone see you struggling. Frank stared at her. No one talked to him like that. No one. I don't know you, Mrs. Mitchell. No, you don't. She stepped closer. But I know you. I know what it looks like when a man's too proud to admit he's drowning. My husband was the same way. Her voice softened. Right up until the day he died. Something flickered in Frank's chest, something uncomfortable. I'm sorry for your loss, he said stiffly. Thank you. She didn't look away. Now, are you going to invite me to see your fields, or are we going to stand here pretending you don't need what I've come to offer? Frank felt his face heat. Ma'am. Ethel. Mrs. Mitchell. He wasn't about to call a widow by her first name. I can't accept charity. Whatever you've got in mind, I can't— Who said anything about charity? He stopped. Ethel Mitchell smiled, and for the first time Frank noticed she wasn't just determined, she was fierce, like a hawk circling prey. I've got 3 barrels of the finest seed wheat in the territory, she said. My husband spent 15 years breeding it. Drought-resistant, early maturing strong stalks. There isn't another strain like it between here and California. I've heard. Then you've heard what it's worth. Frank nodded slowly. That seed was worth more than his whole ranch, probably. More than he could repay in 5 years of good harvests. I'm not giving it to you, Ethel continued. I'm proposing a partnership. Partnership. You've got land. I've got seed. You plant it, I'll help with the work, and we split the harvest. Half to you, half to me. She crossed her arms. That's not charity, Mr. Carson. That's business. Frank's mind raced. Partnership. Not a handout. Not pity. 2 people working together, both contributing, both benefiting. His pride could accept that. Maybe. Why? He asked. Why would you do this? Ethel's expression shifted. Something raw moved behind her eyes. Because my husband didn't spend 15 years developing that seed just so it could sit in my workshop gathering dust. Her voice caught, then steadied. He bred it to help people, to strengthen the community. That's his legacy, Mr. Carson, and I intend to honor it. Frank stood silent for a long moment. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the empty fields. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called the same sound that had felt like judgment yesterday. Today it sounded different, like possibility. You'd work the planting, he said finally. It's hard labor, dawn to dusk for weeks. I grew up on a farm, Mr. Carson. I know what planting requires. Half the harvest, split fair and square. Half each. Frank extended his hand before he could think better of it. Ethel took it. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused from labor. Deal, she said. They shook once, and something that had been clenched tight inside Frank Carson for 13 years began slowly to loosen. She stayed for an hour. They walked the fields together, and Frank showed her the damage, every acre of brittle stalks, every row of broken promises. Ethel didn't flinch. She just nodded and made notes in a small book she carried. The soil's good, she said when they finished. Tired but good. We'll need to rotate next year oats or barley to give the wheat ground a rest. You're already planning next year. You think I'd invest my husband's life work in land that can't sustain it? She tucked the notebook into her pocket. I'll bring 2 barrels tomorrow. Start with the South 40, it's better drained. We'll save the 3rd barrel for the North fields once we see how the first planting takes. Frank watched her mount her horse, still trying to understand what had just happened. Mrs. Mitchell. She paused, looking down at him. Thank you. Thank me after harvest, Mr. Carson, when we've both earned it. She rode off into the afternoon light, and Frank stood watching until she disappeared. The empty granary waited behind him, but for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a promise. That night, Frank sat on his porch with a cup of cold coffee watching the stars come out. Partnership. The word felt strange in his mind. Foreign. He'd been alone so long he'd forgotten what it meant to work alongside someone, to trust someone. His parents had been partners. He remembered that now, the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, the way his father looked at his mother when he thought no one was watching. They'd built their life together brick by brick until the fever took them both in the same terrible week. Frank had been 20 years old, alone ever since. He'd told himself he preferred it that way. Maybe he'd been lying. Ethel arrived at dawn the next day just as she'd promised. Her wagon was loaded with 2 large barrels and enough supplies to last a week. She was dressed in practical work clothes, her hair braided tight, her boots already dusty. "You're early," Frank said. "You're up." She climbed down from the wagon. "Figured you would be. Men like you don't sleep much when there's work to be done." "Men like me, stubborn ones." She smiled slightly. "Help me unload these barrels." They carried the seed to the granary together. Frank was surprised by how heavy it was, premium grain, denser than ordinary wheat. When he lifted the lid and looked inside, his breath caught. Golden kernels. Perfect uniform gleaming in the early light. "James called it morning gold," Ethel said quietly. "He spent 3 years getting the color right. Said farmers should feel hopeful when they looked at their seed, not worried." Frank ran his hand through the grain. It felt like silk, like possibility. "It's beautiful. It's meant to be planted, not admired." Ethel closed the lid. "Now, you got a team ready?" Frank nodded, hitched and waiting. "Then let's get to work." They worked side by side for 12 hours that first day. Frank broke the furrows with his plow, while Ethel followed with the seed drill. They moved in rhythm, not talking much, just working. The sun climbed higher. Sweat soaked through Frank's shirt. His shoulders burned. But he didn't stop. Neither did she. When they broke for lunch, Ethel produced bread and cheese from her saddlebag. They sat in the shade of Frank's wagon, eating in companionable silence. "Your husband," Frank said finally. "He was a good man. The best." Ethel didn't look at him. 17 years we had together. Never a harsh word between us." "That's rare." "It is." She brushed crumbs from her lap. "He died in January. Pneumonia. 1 week he was fine, the next, he was gone." Frank didn't know what to say. Sorry seemed inadequate. Everything seemed inadequate. "I'm glad his seed found good ground," he said at last. Ethel looked at him, then her eyes bright with something he couldn't name. "So am I." By sunset, they'd planted 8 acres. Frank walked the rows after Ethel left, checking the depth, the spacing, the coverage. Everything was perfect. Better than he'd ever done alone. He stood at the edge of the planted field and looked back at his small ranch house. The roof still needed patching. The fence still sagged. But something had changed. The place didn't feel so empty anymore. The next morning, Ethel was there before dawn. And the morning after that. And the morning after that. They fell into a rhythm, working, resting, working again. Frank learned that Ethel took her coffee black and couldn't abide laziness in any form. Ethel learned that Frank talked to his horses when he thought no one was listening and had a dry humor that surprised her. On the 4th day, Frank caught himself laughing at something she said. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed. The town noticed, of course. Frank rode in for supplies at the end of the first week, and the whispers started before he even dismounted. "Heard the widow Mitchell's been spending a lot of time at your place," Tom Bradley said, not quite meeting his eyes. "She's my partner. We're planting her husband's seed in my fields." "Partner?" Tom's eyebrows rose. "That what they're calling it?" Frank's hands curled into fists. "That's what I'm calling it." You got something to say, Tom, say it plain. Tom held up his hands. No offense meant Frank. Just telling you what folks are whispering is all. Widow woman spending every day at a bachelor's ranch, people talk. Let them talk. Frank bought his supplies and left without another word. But the anger stayed with him all the way home. Not because he cared what people thought he'd stopped caring about that years ago, but because Ethel didn't deserve their gossip. She was helping him out of pure generosity, honoring her husband's memory, and small-minded people wanted to make it dirty. When Ethel arrived the next morning, Frank almost told her what Tom had said. But she walked toward him with that determined stride ready to work, and the words died in his throat. He wouldn't burden her with it. He'd just plant faster harvests sooner and prove them all wrong. 2 weeks into planting, they finished the last acre. Frank and Ethel stood at the field's edge exhausted and satisfied. 60 acres of premium wheat planted in good soil watered by the creek. If the weather held, they'd have a harvest to be proud of. We did it, Frank said. We did. Ethel smiled, and something warm spread through Frank's chest. Now we wait. Waiting's the hard part. For you, maybe. She turned to look at him. I expect you'll find excuses to walk these rows every morning and evening checking for sprouts. Frank didn't deny it. She was right, of course. He walked the rows every day, watching for green. After 5 days, the first shoots appeared tiny, fragile, pushing up through dark soil toward sunlight. Frank knelt and touched one gently, afraid to damage it. There you are, he whispered. Come on then, grow. Ethel came 3 times a week now, helping with irrigation and early weeding. The work brought them together side by side in the fields, and Frank found himself looking forward to her arrivals in a way he didn't quite understand. She was nothing like the women he'd imagined marrying back when he'd imagined such things. She wasn't soft or delicate or in need of protection. She was strong and capable, and sometimes sharp-tongued, and she made him want to be better than he was. One afternoon, while they rested in the shade of his wagon, Frank asked the question that had been burning in him for weeks. Why me? Ethel looked up from her water canteen. What do you mean? Your husband's seed. You could have sold it for a fortune, lived comfortable for years. Why give it to a stranger? Ethel was quiet for a long moment. Because James would have wanted it planted, she said finally. Not hoarded, not sold, planted. She met his eyes. And because when Margaret told me about your situation, proud man worked himself to the bone, wouldn't ask for help even when he was drowning, I thought, that sounds like James. And I thought, maybe I can save this one. Frank swallowed hard. You didn't know me. I knew enough. Ethel set down her canteen. I knew you were worth saving. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was ready to name. Frank looked away first. We should get back to work. Yes, Ethel said softly. We should. But that night, alone in his house, Frank couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Worth saving. No one had ever thought he was worth much of anything. He was just Frank Carson, the loner who lived 30 miles from town and kept to himself. The man who'd never married, never had children, never built anything that mattered to anyone but himself. Ethel thought he was worth saving. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. The wheat grew. May brought gentle rains and warming soil, and the fields transformed from brown to green to gold. Frank walked the rows every evening, running his hands through the young stalks, watching them reach toward the sky. James Mitchell's breeding showed in every plant. Uniform height, strong stems, healthy color. This crop was going to be extraordinary. And every time Frank looked at it, he thought of Ethel. She stayed for supper one evening in late May. It happened without planning. They'd worked late, and Frank offered coffee, and coffee turned into stew, and suddenly they were sitting at his table together, eating by lamplight. This is good, Ethel said, gesturing at her bowl. You cook? Had to learn. No one else was going to do it. James couldn't cook to save his life. She smiled at the memory. Burned water, I used to say. But he could grow anything. Put a seed in his hand and something beautiful would come up. You miss him. Every day. Ethel set down her spoon. But he wouldn't want me sitting in that empty house mourning forever. He'd want me living. Frank thought about his own empty house. His empty years. It's hard, he said quietly. Letting someone in, when you've been alone as long as I have. Ethel reached across the table and touched his hand. Brief, light, but it burned like a brand. I know, she said. But maybe it's time to try. Frank didn't pull away, and when she left that night, the cabin felt emptier than it ever had before, because now he knew what he was missing. June came hard and hot. The wheat stood tall, now reaching past Frank's knees, swaying in whatever breeze the land offered. He walked the rows every morning before dawn, checking for pests, for disease, for any sign of trouble. And every morning the wheat looked stronger than the day before. James Mitchell's seed was everything Ethel had promised, maybe more. She arrived at his ranch 3 times a week now, sometimes 4. They worked the irrigation together, hauling water from the creek when the rain didn't come. They pulled weeds side by side, their hands moving through the same soil, their shoulders almost touching. Frank tried not to think about how much he looked forward to those days. He failed. You're quiet this morning, Ethel said, straightening up from a row of wheat. She pressed her hand to her lower back and stretched. Quieter than usual, I mean. Just thinking. About... Frank wiped his forehead with his sleeve. The sun was barely up, and already the heat pressed down like a weight. Tom Bradley asked me yesterday if I was planning to make an honest woman of you. Ethel went still. Did he now? I told him to mind his own business. And what did he say to that? Said the whole town was making it their business. Frank kicked at a clump of dirt. Said people are talking, about you, about your reputation. Ethel was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was steel underneath. Let them talk. It's not right. You're helping me, and they're making it into something dirty. Frank, she stepped closer. I stopped caring what this town thought of me the day they wouldn't let me sit in the front pew at my own husband's funeral because I wasn't born here. Her eyes flashed. They can whisper all they want. I know what I'm doing, and I know why I'm doing it. I just don't want you hurt because of me. Something softened in her face. That's kind, but I can take care of myself. She turned back to the weeds, and Frank stood watching her for a moment longer than he should have. He was in trouble. He knew it. He didn't care. 3 days later, the Reverend Thomas came to call. Frank saw the black buggy coming up the road and felt his stomach tighten. He'd been to church maybe 5 times in the past decade, and the Reverend had never shown any interest in his spiritual welfare before. This wasn't a social visit. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked out to meet the buggy. Reverend. Frank. The Reverend climbed down slowly, his joints stiff from the ride. He was a tall man, thin as a fence post, with eyes that seemed to see everything and judge most of it. Thought I'd stop by, see how you're getting on. Getting on fine. So I hear. The Reverend looked around the ranch, taking in the healthy wheat fields, the repaired fence posts, the general air of industry. Folks say the widow Mitchell's been helping you. She has. Quite a bit of helping, from what I understand. Frank felt his jaw tighten. She's my partner. We planted her husband's seed in my fields. We're splitting the harvest. Partner. The Reverend said the word like it tasted bad. That's a peculiar arrangement between a bachelor and a widow, wouldn't you say? I'd say it's nobody's business but ours. Perhaps. The Reverend stepped closer, lowering his voice. But the appearance of impropriety, Frank, that's a concern. A widow's reputation is fragile. People talk. They assume the worst. Then people are wrong. Are they? The Reverend's eyes were sharp. She's here every day, I'm told. Staying late. Sometimes past dark. We're working. Planting takes time. I'm sure it does. The Reverend sighed, as if Frank was being deliberately obtuse. I'm not accusing you of anything, Frank. I'm just suggesting that perhaps you might want to think about what this looks like, for her sake, if not for yours. Frank stared at him for a long moment. Reverend, he said finally. I've lived alone on this ranch for 13 years. I've never asked anyone for anything. I've never taken charity, never leaned on my neighbors, never been a burden to anyone. And in all that time, not one person from that church of yours has come out here to see if I was alive or dead. Not one. The Reverend's face reddened. But now, Frank continued, his voice hard. Now that a good woman is helping me save my ranch, suddenly everyone's interested in my welfare. Suddenly, everyone's got opinions about what I should do, how I should live. He took a step forward. You want to talk about appearances, Reverend? Let's talk about how it appears when a town ignores a man for a decade and then shows up to lecture him about propriety. Now see here. I think you should go. The Reverend's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Frank like he was seeing him for the first time. You're making a mistake, he said finally. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. The Reverend climbed back into his buggy without another word. Frank watched him drive away, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He'd never talked to anyone like that in his life. It felt good. It felt right. That evening, when Ethel arrived for irrigation work, Frank told her what had happened. Every word of it. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You defended me, she said. I told the truth. You could have agreed with him, made your life easier, kept the peace. I don't want peace. Frank met her eyes. I want to be left alone to do what's right. And what's right is you and me working this land together. Ethel smiled slow and warm. Frank Carson, she said. I think that's the most words I've ever heard you say at once. He felt his face heat. Don't get used to it. Too late. They stood there in the fading light, something new and fragile growing between them. Something neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. Come on, Ethel said finally. Those fields won't water themselves. They worked until dark, and when Ethel rode home that night, Frank stood on his porch watching until he couldn't see her anymore. The Reverend was wrong. The whole town was wrong. Whatever this was, it was worth any price. The drought started slow. First, the creek dropped an inch, then 2, then 5. By the third week of June, the water barely covered Frank's ankles where it used to reach his knees. We need to ration, Ethel said, frowning at the sluggish current. Every drop counts now. They changed their schedule, working in the cooler hours of morning and evening, hauling water when the sun was low. The wheat tolerated the heat better than ordinary grain, but even James Mitchell's breeding had limits. Frank started sleeping in the barn closer to the fields. He told himself it was practical, but the truth was, he couldn't stand lying in his empty house, worrying about things he couldn't control. The wheat, the drought, Ethel, always Ethel. She came to him one afternoon when the heat was at its worst. He was in the barn, mending a harness he'd already mended twice, just to keep his hands busy. You're not sleeping, she said. I'm fine. You're not fine. You've got circles under your eyes and you've lost weight. She crossed her arms. When did you last eat a proper meal? Frank tried to remember. Yesterday. Maybe the day before. Frank? I'm fine, Ethel, really. I just need to keep busy. She walked over and took the harness out of his hands, set it aside. You're going to work yourself to death, she said quietly. And that won't save the crop. Nothing might save the crop. You seen the sky? No clouds for weeks. If this drought doesn't break, then we'll deal with it. Together. She took his hand. Her fingers were cool against his skin. But you have to take care of yourself. You're no good to me dead. Frank looked down at their joined hands. He should pull away. He knew he should. This was dangerous territory, the kind that led to places he wasn't sure he could go. But he didn't pull away. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Do what? Any of it." He forced himself to meet her eyes. "The partnership, the waiting, the way I feel when you're here versus when you're not." His voice dropped. "I've been alone so long, Ethel. I don't know how to be anything else." Ethel squeezed his hand. "Neither do I," she said. "James was my whole world for 17 years. When he died, I thought I'd never feel anything again. Just empty forever." She stepped closer. "But then I heard about you, about your failed crop, and your stubborn pride, and your determination to face it alone. And something in me woke up, something that said, maybe I wasn't done yet. Maybe there was still something I could do that mattered. You've done more than enough." "No." Her voice was fierce. "I haven't. Because I didn't just come here to plant wheat, Frank. I came here because I was drowning in grief, and I needed a reason to keep going. You gave me that reason." Frank's heart hammered in his chest. "Ethel, you don't have to say anything." She released his hand and stepped back. "I just wanted you to know. This partnership saved me as much as it saved you." She left him standing in the barn, reeling. And for the first time in 13 years, Frank Carson understood what it meant to not be alone. The town gossip grew worse. Frank heard it every time he rode in for supplies, the whispers that stopped when he entered the general store, the knowing looks exchanged between women at the church steps, the way conversation died when he walked into the feed shop. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, was the worst. "2 pounds of coffee," Frank said, placing his money on the counter. She weighed it out without looking at him. "Heard the widow Mitchell's spending all her time out at your place these days." "She's my partner." "That's what they're calling it." Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "Her husband barely cold in the ground, and she's already playing house with a bachelor. Shameful if you ask me." Frank's hands curled into fists. "I didn't ask you." "Well, someone should tell her. A woman her age gallivanting around the countryside, ruining her reputation." "Mrs. Henderson." Frank's voice was quiet, but something in it made her stop. "Ethel Mitchell is the finest woman I've ever known. She's helping me save my ranch out of pure generosity because that's the kind of person she is. And if you or anyone else in this town says one more word against her, I'll make sure you regret it." Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. Frank took his coffee and walked out. He was shaking when he reached his horse. Shaking with anger, with frustration, with the terrible knowledge that no matter what he did, people would think the worst. But he'd meant what he said. Ethel was worth fighting for. He just wished he knew how to tell her. July brought no relief. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and the creek dropped lower every day. Frank and Ethel worked in shifts, now hauling water in the gray hours before dawn and after sunset. The wheat showed signs of stress leaves, curling growth slowing, but it held on. James Mitchell's breeding was keeping them alive. Barely. "We need rain," Frank said one evening, staring at the cloudless sky. "A week without water, and we'll start losing plants." "I know." Ethel stood beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion. "But we can't make it rain. All we can do is keep the plants alive until it comes." "What if it doesn't come?" "Then we lose everything." Her voice was steady, but Frank heard the fear underneath. "But we're not there yet. We're not beaten yet." "No." Frank looked at her. "We're not." They stood together in silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon. And then Frank said something he'd been holding back for weeks. "I don't want to lose you, Ethel." She turned to look at him. "I mean," he fumbled for words. "The crop. If we lose the crop, you've given up everything for nothing. Your husband's seed, your time, your reputation. All for nothing. Is that what you think this is about?" Ethel stepped closer. "The seed, the harvest." "I don't know what to think anymore." "Then let me be clear." She took his hand. "I came here for the crop, yes. But I stayed for you. I stayed because working beside you made me feel alive again. Because your stubbornness makes me laugh, and your kindness makes me cry, and somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of this as a business arrangement." Frank's heart stopped. "Ethel. I love you, Frank Carson." The words hung in the air between them, bold and terrifying and true. "I didn't plan to. I didn't want to. But I do. And whatever happens with this harvest, that's not going to change." Frank stared at her. 13 years of loneliness. 13 years of convincing himself he didn't need anyone. 13 years of building walls so high he forgot there was anything on the other side. And now this woman had walked through every single one. "I don't deserve you," he said. "Probably not." She smiled through tears. "But I'm here anyway." He kissed her. It wasn't graceful or practiced. It was desperate and clumsy and absolutely perfect. She tasted like dust and sweat and hope, and when she kissed him back, Frank felt something inside him break open and bloom. "I love you too," he said against her lips. "God help me, I love you too." They held each other as darkness fell, two broken people finding something whole together. And for one perfect moment the drought didn't matter. Nothing mattered except this. The next morning, Frank woke to a strange light. He stumbled out of the barn where he'd been sleeping and stopped dead. The sky was wrong. Green-gray clouds piled up in the west, moving fast. The air felt thick, heavy, charged with something electric. The wheat swayed violently in a wind that had come from nowhere. Frank's blood went cold. "Hail!" He ran for his horse. Ethel was already riding toward him when he hit the road. She must have seen the same sky, felt the same dread. "Frank." She reined in beside him. "We need to cover what we can." "With what? We don't have enough canvas, not for 60 acres. "Then we save what we can." Her voice was fierce. "We don't give up. We never give up." They worked in frantic silence, stretching every piece of canvas and burlap they could find over the most mature sections of wheat. The wind tore at their clothes, their hair, their hope. The green sky churned closer. Frank's hands were bleeding by the time the first drops fell. Not hail. Rain. He looked up, disbelieving. The drops were fat and warm, nothing like the ice he'd feared. The green clouds that had promised destruction instead delivered mercy. "Rain?" Ethel breathed. "It's just rain." Frank pulled her into his arms as the heavens opened. They stood in the middle of his wheat field, soaking wet, laughing like fools. "We're going to make it," she said into his chest. "Frank, we're actually going to make it." He held her tighter. "Yeah," he said. "I think we are." The rain lasted 3 days. When it finally stopped, Frank's creek was running high again, and his wheat stood tall and healthy under the August sun. The drought was broken. The crop was saved. But the town's judgment wasn't finished with them yet. It was Mrs. Henderson who started it. Frank heard about it from Tom Bradley, who looked uncomfortable delivering the news. "She's organizing a petition," Tom said, not meeting Frank's eyes. "Wants the church to formally censure Ethel for, improper conduct." "Improper conduct." Frank's voice was flat. "For helping a neighbor plant wheat. For spending time alone with an unmarried man." Tom shifted his weight. "Look, I don't agree with it. But Mrs. Henderson's got a lot of influence, and she's been talking to the other church ladies. They're saying Ethel should be barred from Sunday services until she publicly repents." Frank felt something cold settle in his chest. Repents for what? For being generous? For working hard? For saving my ranch? For being seen with you? Tom finally met his eyes. "I'm sorry, Frank. I know it's not fair." Frank rode home in a fury. He found Ethel in his kitchen making coffee like she belonged there. Because she did belong there. She belonged with him. "There's something you need to know," he said. He told her everything. When he finished, Ethel's face was very still. "I see," she said. "We can fight this. We can—" "How?" She set down her coffee cup. by causing more scandal, by making enemies of everyone in town. She shook her head. This is my fight, Frank, not yours. The hell it isn't. I love you. That makes it my fight. And what will you do, storm into the church and defend my honor? That'll just make things worse. Then what? We just let them win. Ethel was quiet for a long moment. There is one way, she said slowly. One way to silence them all. What? She looked at him. Her eyes were steady, but he saw vulnerability underneath. You could marry me. Frank stared at her. I know it's not romantic, she continued. I know this isn't how proposals are supposed to happen. But if we're married, they can't say anything. We'd be respectable. Above reproach. Ethel. Frank crossed the room and took her hands. I don't want to marry you to silence gossip. Her face fell. I understand. It was a foolish idea. I want to marry you because I love you. He lifted her chin so she met his eyes. Because I can't imagine waking up without you. Because you walked into my life when I was ready to give up, and you gave me a reason to keep fighting. Frank. Marry me, Ethel. Not because of what people say, because of what we are. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Frank. I'll marry you. He kissed her, and for the second time in his life, Frank Carson cried. But this time the tears were joy. The news of their engagement spread through Miller's Creek like wildfire. Frank heard about it before he even reached town. A rider passed him on the road, tipped his hat, and said, Congratulations on your upcoming nuptials, Mr. Carson. Frank hadn't told a soul except Ethel. But Ethel had told Margaret Wilson. And Margaret Wilson had told everyone. By the time Frank tied his horse outside the general store, half the town seemed to know. Some folks nodded at him with genuine warmth. Others turned away their disapproval plain on their faces. Mrs. Henderson was waiting behind the counter, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Carson. Mrs. Henderson. I hear you're marrying the widow Mitchell. I am. Awfully convenient timing. Her voice dripped with insinuation. Right when folks start asking questions about all those visits. Frank leaned on the counter, his eyes hard. Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to marry the woman I love. You can be happy for us, or you can keep spreading poison. But either way, it's happening. And either way, I'm done caring what you think. He left without buying anything. Outside, Tom Bradley caught up with him. Frank, wait. Frank turned. You got more bad news for me, Tom. No. Tom looked uncomfortable. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what I said before, about people talking. He shuffled his feet. Truth is, I've known you 13 years. Never once saw you smile until that widow showed up. And if she makes you happy, well, that's good enough for me. Frank stared at him. Thank you, Tom. Don't thank me. Just invite me to the wedding. For the first time in days, Frank laughed. Deal. Ethel was waiting for him when he got home. She was in the kitchen again, and Frank realized with a jolt that he'd started thinking of it as their kitchen. The cabin that had been his alone for 13 years was slowly becoming theirs. How bad was it? She asked. Could have been worse. He hung up his hat. Tom Bradley apologized, said he'd like to come to the wedding. Ethel smiled. That's something. Mrs. Henderson's still on the warpath, though. She'll come around, or she won't. Ethel shrugged. Either way, I don't care anymore. Frank crossed to her and took her hands. When do you want to do this? The wedding, I mean. After harvest. Her eyes met his. I want to know we've earned it first, that this partnership worked the way we planned. And if it doesn't, it will. She squeezed his hands. I have faith. Frank wished he shared her certainty, but something in the air felt wrong. August should have been straightforward. The wheat was tall and golden, nearly ready for harvest. The rains had filled the creek. The worst of the drought was behind them. All they had to do was wait another few weeks, and everything Frank had worked for would finally come to fruition. But the weather didn't cooperate. The heat came back with a vengeance. Day after day of blazing sun, no clouds, no relief. The creek started dropping again. The wheat, so close to maturity, began to show stress. "We need 2 more weeks," Ethel said, kneeling in the field examining the grain heads. "Just 2 more weeks and it'll be ready to cut." "Will it last that long?" She didn't answer. That was answer enough. They went back to rationing water, working dawn and dusk, to keep the plants alive. Frank's hands cracked and bled from hauling buckets. Ethel's face grew gaunt with exhaustion. But they didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Everything depended on this harvest. On the 5th day of the new heat wave, Frank noticed something strange. The temperature was dropping. Not gradually the way it did when autumn approached. Suddenly. Sharply. Like someone had opened a door to winter in the middle of August. He stood in his field watching his breath fog in the air and felt his blood run cold. Frost. In August. It was impossible. But the thermometer didn't lie. Frank ran. He burst into Ethel's ranch 20 minutes later, his horse lathered and blowing. "Frost!" he gasped. "Tonight. Maybe tomorrow. The temperature's dropping like a stone." Ethel's face went white. "That's impossible. It's August." "I know what I saw, what I felt." He grabbed her arm. "We need smudge pots. Everyone we can find. Burlap, canvas, anything that'll hold heat. If that frost hits the wheat before it's ready." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. They loaded Ethel's wagon in frantic silence. Every smudge pot she owned. Every piece of burlap in her barn. Coal oil by the gallon. Matches, blankets, anything that might help. The sun was setting by the time they reached Frank's ranch, and the air was already bitter cold. Frank could see his breath clearly now. The wheat stood tall and golden in the fading light, so close to ready. So close. "We'll start at the north end," Ethel said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Work our way south. Light everything we've got." "It won't be enough." "Then we do what we can and pray." They worked in desperate rhythm. Frank dug holes for the smudge pots, while Ethel filled them with coal oil. They lit them one by one, creating a line of fire through the darkness. Thick, acrid smoke rose from each pot, spreading low over the wheat, trapping whatever heat the day had left. But the field was 60 acres, and they had maybe 30 pots. "We're not going to make it," Frank said, his voice cracking. "The whole north section, there's nothing covering it." "Keep working." "Ethel, look at the sky. It's already below freezing up there. When that cold hits the ground..." "Keep working, Frank." She grabbed another pot and ran. Frank watched her disappear into the darkness, her figure lit briefly by the flames she left behind. She was fighting a battle they couldn't win, and she knew it. But she wouldn't give up, and neither would he. He grabbed a pot and followed. Hours passed. The cold deepened. Frank's hands went numb, despite the heat from the smudge pots. His fingers fumbled with matches, dropped them in the dirt, lit them again. Beside him, Ethel worked in grim silence, her breath clouding in the freezing air. They met in the middle of the field, sometime after midnight. Both of them were exhausted. Both were covered in soot and coal oil. Both knew they hadn't done enough. "It's over," Frank said. "We've placed everything. There's nothing left." Ethel looked at the scattered fires, the thin layer of smoke that couldn't possibly cover all 60 acres. "I know. If we lose this crop, don't." She grabbed his arm. "Don't say it." "I have to say it." Frank's voice broke. "If we lose this crop, I've cost you everything. Your husband's seed, your time, your reputation, everything you gave me gone, because I wasn't enough. Stop. It's true. It's not true." Ethel turned to face him, her eyes fierce despite the tears freezing on her cheeks. "Listen to me, Frank Carson. Whatever happens tonight, you have not cost me anything. I chose to help you. I chose to work beside you. I chose to love you. That's not your fault. That's my decision." But the seed was meant to be planted, not hoarded. James would rather see it die in the ground than rot in my workshop. She cupped his face in her frozen hands. "We did everything right. We worked hard. We earned this harvest. If God takes it from us anyway, that's not failure. That's just life." Frank stared at her. All his life he'd measured himself by what he built, what he produced, what he could show for his labor. Failure meant losing those things. Success meant keeping them. But Ethel was offering him a different measure. Not what you build, what you become while building it. "I love you," he said. "I know." "No, I mean..." He struggled for words. "I love you more than the crop, more than the ranch, more than any of it. If I lose everything tonight but still have you, I'll count myself blessed." Ethel smiled through her tears. "Then let's keep fighting, together." They returned to work. The hours crawled toward dawn. Frank's body screamed for rest. Every muscle ached. His lungs burned from the smoke. But he kept moving, checking temperatures, adjusting pots, fighting the cold with everything he had. Ethel worked beside him, never complaining, never slowing. They moved in practiced rhythm. Two people who had learned each other's patterns through weeks of labor. When Frank stumbled, Ethel caught his arm. When Ethel flagged, Frank took her weight. Together. Always together. Around 4 in the morning, Frank noticed something. The thermometer had stopped dropping. He stared at it, not daring to believe. 31 degrees. Freezing, but not deadly. The wheat could survive 31 degrees for a few hours. Maybe. "Ethel!" he called. She came running, her face streaked with soot and exhaustion. "What is it?" "Look." He pointed at the thermometer. "It's holding. It's not getting colder." Ethel's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, thank God." "It's not over yet. If it drops again..." "It won't." She pointed east. "Look!" The horizon was turning pink. Dawn was coming. And with it, warmth. They stood together watching the sun rise over their fields. The smudge pots still burned, sending thin plumes of smoke into the brightening sky. The wheat stood frozen, but unbroken, waiting for the sun to thaw it. "We did it?" Ethel whispered. "We don't know yet." "I know." She took his hand. "I can feel it." Frank looked at her, exhausted, filthy, radiant with hope, and felt something crack open in his chest. This woman had given him everything. Her husband's legacy, her labor, her love, and she'd asked for nothing in return except his partnership. "Marry me today," he said. Ethel blinked. "What? Right now, this morning, ride to town, find the Reverend and marry me." Frank squeezed her hand. "I don't want to wait for harvest. I don't want to wait for anything. I just want to be your husband." "Frank, we're covered in soot. We haven't slept in 20 hours. We don't even know if the crop survived." "I don't care." He stepped closer. "Do you..." Ethel looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. "No," she said. "I don't care either." They rode to town at dawn. The streets were empty, the respectable folk still in bed. Frank and Ethel dismounted at the church, both of them filthy, both of them exhausted, both of them grinning like fools. Reverend Thomas answered his door in his nightshirt. "What in God's name? We need you to marry us," Frank said. "Right now." The Reverend stared at them, at their soot-covered clothes, their wild eyes, their clasped hands. "It's 6 in the morning." "We know." "You look like you've been fighting a fire." "We have." "And you want to get married, right now?" "Yes." The Reverend looked at Ethel. "Mrs. Mitchell, is this what you want?" "More than anything." Something shifted in the Reverend's face. The judgment that had been there before softened into something else. Something almost like respect. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. "I'll get dressed." They were married in the empty church at 6:30 in the morning. No guests, no flowers, no fancy clothes. Just Frank and Ethel standing before God and Reverend Thomas, promising to love and cherish each other until death. Frank's hands shook as he slipped his mother's ring onto Ethel's finger. He'd kept it all these years, never imagining he'd have someone to give it to. Now he did. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said. "You may kiss the bride." Frank kissed her, and for one perfect moment, nothing else mattered. They rode back to the ranch as husband and wife. The sun was fully up now, warming the air, melting the frost. Frank's heart pounded as they approached the fields. This was the moment of truth. Either the wheat had survived, or everything they'd fought for was lost. Ethel gripped his hand as they dismounted. "Together," she said. "Together." They walked into the field. The wheat was damaged. Frank could see it immediately. Some of the stalks drooped where the frost had hit hardest. Brown patches marked the places where their smudge pots hadn't reached. But most of it was still standing. Golden heads heavy with grain swaying gently in the morning breeze. Alive, salvageable. Frank dropped to his knees in the dirt. "We made it," he breathed. "Ethel, we made it." She knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "We made it." They stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the wheat, holding each other, crying with relief and exhaustion and joy. They'd planted in faith. They'd worked in hope. And against all odds, they'd survived. Later that morning, Margaret Wilson came riding up the road. She found Frank and Ethel on the porch, sitting side by side drinking coffee like two people who'd earned a rest. They were still wearing their soot-covered clothes. Neither of them cared. "I heard about the frost," Margaret said, dismounting. "Came to see if you needed help and found your fields smoking like the devil's own backyard." She squinted at them. "You two look like something the cat dragged in." "We got married this morning," Ethel said. Margaret's mouth fell open. "You what?" "Got married. At dawn. In the church." "In those clothes." "In these clothes." Margaret stared at them for a long moment. Then she burst out laughing. "Lord have mercy," she said, wiping her eyes. "Only you two would fight a frost all night and then ride to church in your work clothes to get hitched." She climbed the porch steps and hugged Ethel fiercely. "Congratulations, honey. You deserve every happiness." "Thank you, Margaret." Margaret turned to Frank. "And you. You take care of her, you hear? She's the best woman in this territory." "I know she is." Margaret nodded, satisfied. "Now, what can I do to help with that wheat?" Word spread fast. By noon, half the territory knew that Frank Carson and Ethel Mitchell had gotten married at dawn after fighting a frost all night. It was the kind of story people loved to tell, romantic, dramatic, slightly scandalous. And it changed everything. The folks who had whispered about impropriety now spoke of devotion. The women who had sniffed at Ethel's reputation now admired her dedication. Even Mrs. Henderson, when she heard the full story, had the grace to look ashamed. They'd won. Not just the battle against the frost. The battle against judgment. That evening, Frank and Ethel sat on their porch watching the sunset paint their fields in shades of gold and rose. "We should check the damage tomorrow," Ethel said. "Figure out how much we lost." "Tomorrow." Frank pulled her closer. "Tonight, I just want to sit here with my wife." Ethel smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. "Your wife. I like the sound of that. Get used to it." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out. The wheat would need tending. The harvest would require planning. There was work ahead, always more work. But for now, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Frank Carson had spent 13 years alone. Tonight, he wasn't alone anymore. And he never would be again. The damage was worse than they'd hoped. Frank walked the fields with Ethel the morning after their wedding, counting the losses row by row. The north section had taken the hardest hit. Nearly 8 acres of wheat lay flattened, the stalks blackened where the frost had killed them. 8 acres, Frank said quietly. Maybe 9. Ethel knelt and examined a damaged stalk. Her face was calm, but Frank saw the grief underneath. The rest looked salvageable, 50 acres give or take. That's still a harvest. It is. She stood and brushed dirt from her knees. Not what we hoped for, but enough. Frank looked at the ruined section, then back at his wife. His wife. The word still felt strange. Wonderful, but strange. I'm sorry, he said. For what? For the loss. For the 8 acres we couldn't save. Ethel took his hand. Frank Carson, we fought a frost in August. In August. The fact that we saved anything at all is a miracle. She squeezed his fingers. Stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault. Old habit. Then break it. She kissed him quick and firm, and Frank felt the weight in his chest ease a little. They'd lost 8 acres, but they still had each other. That was enough. The wheat ripened fast after the frost scare. Nature seemed determined to make up for the trauma, pouring warmth and sunshine onto the surviving stalks. Within a week, the grain heads had turned from pale gold to deep amber. Frank checked them every morning, rubbing kernels between his palms, testing for hardness. 3 more days, he told Ethel on the 1st of September. Maybe 4. Then we cut. I'll send word to the neighbors. You think they'll come? Ethel smiled. After our wedding story, they wouldn't miss it for the world. She was right. When harvest day arrived, half the territory showed up at Frank's ranch. Tom Bradley came with his 2 sons. Margaret Wilson brought her husband and 3 farmhands. Even Harrison Cobb, the cattle broker who'd tried to cheat Frank back in spring, rode in with a wagon and an apologetic expression. Heard you could use some help, Harrison said, not quite meeting Frank's eyes. I can always use help. About that offer I made you, for the cattle. Harrison shuffled his feet. That wasn't right of me, taking advantage of a man when he's down. Frank studied him for a long moment. Water under the bridge. Harrison's shoulders relaxed. Much obliged, Frank. Much obliged. They worked from dawn until dusk. A dozen men with scythes moved through the wheat in practiced rhythm cutting and bundling. Women brought food and water, keeping everyone fed and hydrated. Children gathered fallen grain into sacks, treating it like treasure. Frank worked alongside them, all his scythe flashing in the sunlight, his heart fuller than it had ever been. This was community. This was what he'd been missing all those lonely years. Ethel worked the bundling, tying cut wheat into sheaves with quick, efficient movements. Frank caught himself watching her when he should have been cutting. The way she moved, the way she laughed, the way she fit into his life like she'd always been there. You're staring, Tom Bradley said, appearing beside him. I'm admiring. Same thing. Tom grinned. She's a fine woman, Frank. You're lucky. I know. Don't forget it. I won't. By the 3rd day, the wheat was cut and shocked, standing in neat bundles across the fields. By the end of the week, they'd threshed half the crop. The grain poured into Frank's wagon in a golden river, each bushel a small miracle. Tom Bradley helped with the weighing. He whistled low when he saw the numbers. Best yield I've seen in 5 years, Frank, even with the frost damage. That Mitchell seed is something special. Yes, sir, it is. You planning to save some for next year? Frank looked at Ethel, who was directing the loading of another wagon. That's up to my wife. The word still made him smile. Ethel came over when she heard her name. What's up to me? Whether we save seed for next year. She considered for a moment. We'll save enough for our fields, plus extra to sell. James would have wanted his work to spread. She looked at Tom. You interested in buying Mr. Bradley? Ma'am, I'd be first in line. Then we'll talk price after harvest. Tom tipped his hat. Yes, ma'am. He walked away, and Ethel turned to Frank with a satisfied expression. We're going to be all right, she said. Better than all right. Much better. She kissed him right there in front of everyone, and Frank didn't care who saw. Let them look. Let them all see what love looked like. The final count came in at sunset on the last day of threshing. Frank stood in his granary surrounded by barrels of golden wheat and tried to make sense of the numbers Ethel had written in her ledger. 412 bushels, she said, even after the frost losses. 412. At current prices, that's nearly $2,000. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. Frank, we did it. We actually did it. $2,000. More money than Frank had ever seen in his life. Enough to pay off his debts, buy supplies for winter, and still have plenty left over for spring planting. Enough to build a future. Half is yours, he said. That was the deal. I know. Ethel closed the ledger. But I don't need it. What do you mean? I mean, this is our ranch now. Our life. Our money. She took his hands. I don't want to divide everything into yours and mine. I want it to be ours. Frank stared at her. Ethel, unless you'd rather keep things separate, I'd understand if... He kissed her to stop the words. Ours, he said against her lips. Everything. Ours. She smiled, and Frank felt like the richest man in the territory. Not because of the wheat, because of her. The celebration that night was the biggest Miller's Creek had seen in years. Someone produced a fiddle. Someone else brought a jug of whiskey. Tables appeared from nowhere laden with food the women had been preparing all week. Children ran between the adults laughing and shrieking. Dogs barked. Horses nickered. And in the middle of it all, Frank and Ethel danced. Frank hadn't danced in 20 years. Hadn't seen the point. But Ethel pulled him onto the makeshift floor, and suddenly his feet remembered what his mind had forgotten. You're not bad, she said, surprised. My mother taught me. Long time ago. She taught you well. They moved together through the music, and Frank felt the years of loneliness fall away. He'd spent so long building walls protecting himself from hurt that he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. Ethel had broken through every barrier, and he was grateful. Around midnight, the Reverend Thomas approached them. Frank tensed, expecting judgment, but the Reverend's face was soft in the lamplight. I owe you both an apology, he said. Frank blinked. Reverend, I came to your ranch with suspicion in my heart, assumed the worst about your partnership. The Reverend shook his head. But watching you these past months, watching you work together, fight together, love together, I was wrong, dead wrong. Reverend, you don't have to. Yes, I do. The Reverend took Ethel's hand. Mrs. Carson, you're a credit to this community. What you did for Frank, what you did for all of us, that's the kind of generosity that puts my sermons to shame. Ethel's eyes glistened. Thank you, Reverend. No, ma'am, thank you. He turned to Frank. And you, Frank Carson, you're a better man than I gave you credit for. I hope you'll forgive an old fool his prejudices. Frank extended his hand. Forgiven, Reverend. They shook, and something that had been broken was made whole. The celebration continued until the small hours. But around 2 a.m, Frank noticed someone hovering at the edge of the crowd. A woman well-dressed watching the festivities with an expression he couldn't read. Mrs. Henderson. Frank's jaw tightened. She hadn't been invited. After everything she'd done, the gossip, the petition, the attempts to ruin Ethel's reputation, she had no right to be here. He started toward her, ready to ask her to leave, but Ethel caught his arm. Wait. Ethel, I know what she did. Ethel's voice was calm. Let me handle this. She walked toward Mrs. Henderson alone. Frank watched his heart pounding. The two women stood face to face. Mrs. Henderson's posture was stiff defensive. Ethel's was relaxed open. They talked for several minutes. Frank couldn't hear what was said, But he saw Mrs. Henderson's expression change, saw her shoulders drop, saw her wipe her eyes. Then Ethel did something that made Frank's breath catch. She hugged her. Ethel Carson hugged the woman who had tried to destroy her reputation, and Mrs. Henderson hugged her back. When Ethel returned, Frank stared at her. "What did you say to her?" "I told her I forgave her." Ethel shrugged. "She lost her husband 3 years ago, never remarried, never moved on. I think she was jealous of what we have, and jealousy made her cruel. And you forgave her just like that. Just like that." Ethel took his hand. "Holding grudges is heavy work, Frank. I'd rather carry joy." Frank looked at his wife, this extraordinary woman who had saved his ranch, saved his soul, and now taught him what grace looked like in action. "I don't deserve you," he said. "Probably not." She smiled. "But you've got me anyway." September faded into October. The wheat was sold, the debts were paid, and Frank's bank account held more money than he'd ever dreamed of. He used some of it to repair the ranch, new shingles on the roof, a proper fence around the pasture, a fresh coat of whitewash on the cabin. But the biggest change was invisible. The emptiness was gone. Frank woke every morning to Ethel beside him and went to sleep every night with her in his arms. They worked the land together, ate together, planned together. 2 lives that had been separate were now woven into one. "I want to expand the south pasture," Ethel said one evening over dinner. "Plant oats next spring. Give the wheat ground a rest." "Makes sense. We'll need to clear that scrub section first." "I was thinking we could hire some help. Billy Tanner's been looking for work." "The kid from the feed store. He's 16 strong as an ox and eager to learn." Ethel set down her fork. "Besides, it might be nice to have someone else around, for when things get busy." Something in her voice made Frank look up. "Ethel." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "But I might be—" She stopped, started again. "There might be a reason we need extra help." Frank's heart stopped. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I'm late. Very late." Her eyes met his, shining with hope and fear. "I didn't want to say anything until I was certain, but—" Frank was out of his chair before she finished. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his whole body shaking. "Ethel. Ethel. I might be wrong. I'm 42. It might just be—" "You're not wrong." He pulled back to look at her face. "I can feel it. I don't know how, but I can feel it." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I thought I'd never have this," she whispered. "James and I tried for years. I thought something was wrong with me." "Nothing's wrong with you. Nothing was ever wrong with you. But what if—" "No what ifs." Frank cupped her face in his hands. "Whatever happens, we face it together. That's what we do." Ethel laughed through her tears. "That's what we do," she repeated. They held each other in the lamplight, 2 people who'd thought they'd never have a family, suddenly standing on the edge of one. A week later, the doctor confirmed it. Ethel was pregnant. The baby would come in spring around planting time. Frank couldn't stop grinning when he heard the news. He walked around the ranch like a man in a dream, unable to believe his fortune. 6 months ago, he'd been alone in a dead field, watching his life crumble. Now he had a wife who loved him, a harvest in his granary, and a child on the way. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor," Ethel said, watching him pace. "I can't help it. I'm—" He stopped, laughed. "I don't have words for what I am. Happy. More than happy. More than anything. Then sit down and drink your coffee before you drive me crazy." He sat, he drank. But his mind kept spinning, planning, dreaming. A child. His child. Their child. He thought about his father who'd built the granary with his own hands, about his mother who'd taught him to dance. They'd never met Ethel, never would. But somehow Frank felt like they'd approve. I want to name the baby after my parents, he said suddenly. If it's a boy, James, after your husband. If it's a girl, Sarah, after my mother. Ethel's eyes widened. You'd name our son after James. He saved my life. His seed, his legacy, without that, none of this would exist. Frank took her hand. He deserves to be remembered. Ethel couldn't speak for a long moment. He would have liked you, she finally said. James would have liked you very much. I hope so. I know so. They sat together in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, hearts full. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer frightening. Whatever came, they'd face it together. That was their promise. That was their partnership. That was their love. October arrived with crisp air and changing leaves. Frank and Ethel divided the harvest exactly as originally planned, even though Ethel had said she didn't want her share separate. The formality mattered to Frank. It proved they'd honored their agreement, proved the partnership had worked. Half to her, half to him, fair and square. Then they combined it all into one account with both their names on it. Our money, Ethel said, signing the bank papers. Our future. Frank agreed. They walked out of the bank hand in hand, and Frank saw something he'd never expected. Mrs. Henderson, standing across the street, raised her hand in a small wave. Frank waved back. Miracles do happen, he muttered. All the time, Ethel said. You just have to know where to look. That evening they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the fields in shades of amber and rose. Ethel's hand rested on her still flat stomach. Frank's arm wrapped around her shoulders. What are you thinking about? She asked. The granary. What about it? It's full. Frank shook his head slowly. 6 months ago it was empty. My father built it 40 years ago, and it had never been empty at harvest time, not until this year. And now it's full again. Fuller than ever. He looked at her. Because of you. Because of us. Because of us, he agreed. The stars came out one by one, and Frank Carson, who had spent 13 years alone, thanked God for every single one of them. Because each star reminded him of how far he'd come, and how much further he still had to go, with Ethel beside him, always. Winter came hard that year. The first snow fell in early November, blanketing the ranch in white. Frank woke before dawn to find Ethel already up, standing at the window, with her hand pressed to her stomach. Everything all right? He asked, coming to stand beside her. Just watching the snow. She leaned into him. James used to say the first snow was good luck, meant the ground would be ready for spring planting. Smart man? He was. She turned to look at Frank. I've been thinking about something. What's that? The old Mitchell place. My ranch. She paused. I want to sell it. Frank blinked. You sure? It's sitting empty. The house, the workshop, everything James built, it's just gathering dust. Her voice caught, then steadied. But there's a young family in town, the Dawsons. They've been looking for land and they can't afford much. I thought maybe you want to sell it to them cheap. I want to give them a chance, like you gave me a chance. Frank pulled her closer. I didn't give you anything, Ethel. You gave me everything. Then let me pass it on. He kissed her forehead. Do what you need to do. I'll support you. A week later, the Dawson family moved into the Mitchell Ranch. Tom Dawson was a young man, barely 25, with a wife and 2 small children. He'd been working odd jobs around Miller's Creek, trying to save enough to buy land. Ethel sold him the ranch for 1/4 of its value, with payments spread over 5 years. I can't accept this, Tom said when he heard the terms. It's too generous. It's exactly right. Ethel pressed the deed into his hands. My husband spent his whole life trying to help other farmers succeed. This is how I honor him, by helping you. Tom's wife Mary burst into tears. We'll never forget this, Mrs. Carson. Never. Just take care of the land. That's all I ask. The Dawsons moved in the next day, and watching them young and hopeful and full of dreams, Frank understood something he'd been too blind to see before. Legacy wasn't about what you kept, it was about what you gave away. December brought more snow and shorter days. Frank spent most of his time preparing for spring mending equipment, planning crops, making sure everything was ready. Ethel worked alongside him when she felt well enough, though the pregnancy was starting to show now. "You should rest more," Frank said one afternoon, watching her stack supplies in the barn. "I'll rest when the baby comes." Ethel. "I'm fine, Frank. I'm pregnant, not dying." But that night she woke him with a gasp. "Frank! Frank, something's wrong." He was out of bed in an instant, lighting the lamp with shaking hands. Ethel was curled on her side, her face pale, her arms wrapped around her stomach. "What is it? What's happening?" "I don't know. I felt something, a cramp, maybe. Sharp." She looked up at him, fear in her eyes. "Frank, if I lose this baby..." "You won't." He was already pulling on his boots. "I'm getting the doctor. It's the middle of the night. The snow. I don't care if it's the end of the world. I'm getting the doctor." He rode through the blizzard. The snow was so thick he could barely see his horse's ears. Wind cut through his coat like a knife. His hands went numb on the reins. But he kept riding, pushing harder than he'd ever pushed in his life. The doctor's house was dark when he arrived. Frank pounded on the door until his fists ached. "Doctor? Doctor, please." A light flickered in the window. The door opened, revealing Dr. Harris in his nightshirt, spectacles askew. "Frank Carson." "What in God's name?" "My wife. Something's wrong with the baby. You have to come, now." The doctor didn't hesitate. "Let me get my bag." They rode back together through the storm. Frank's heart pounded the entire way, his mind racing through every terrible possibility. If he lost Ethel, if he lost the baby, if this miracle he'd been given was snatched away. He couldn't think about it. He wouldn't. They reached the ranch to find Ethel sitting up in bed, her color better, her breathing steady. "I think it passed," she said when they burst through the door. "The pain stopped about 20 minutes ago." Dr. Harris examined her carefully while Frank paced outside the bedroom door. Minutes felt like hours. Every sound made him jump. Finally, the doctor emerged. "She's all right," he said. "The baby's all right." Frank's knees nearly buckled. "What happened?" "Just cramping. It happens sometimes, especially in older mothers. She needs rest, real rest, not just taking it easy. But there's no danger. Not yet." Frank grabbed the doctor's hand and shook it, unable to speak. "Go see your wife, Frank. She's asking for you." He went. Ethel was lying against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said. "I scared you. I should have rested more like you said. Stop." Frank sat on the bed and took her hands. "Don't apologize. Don't ever apologize. You and this baby are the only things that matter. Everything else, the ranch, the crops, all of it, I'd burn it to the ground if it meant keeping you safe." "Frank, I mean it." His voice broke. "I spent 13 years thinking I didn't need anyone, thinking I was stronger alone. And then you showed up with your husband's seed and your stubborn generosity, and you proved me wrong. You gave me everything, Ethel, everything." She pulled him down and held him while he cried. And Frank Carson, who hadn't wept since he was 14 years old, let himself break open completely. Because he finally understood what love really meant. It meant being willing to shatter. Christmas came softly that year. Frank and Ethel spent it alone, just the two of them by the fire in their small cabin. They exchanged simple gifts, a new shawl he'd ordered from back east, a carved wooden box she'd made for his tobacco. But the real gift was something else entirely. "Feel," Ethel said, pressing Frank's hand to her stomach. He felt nothing at first. Then a flutter, so faint he might have imagined it. "Was that? That was your child saying hello," Frank stared at his hand at Ethel's rounded belly, at the miracle growing inside her. "Hello," he whispered. "Hello, little one." The flutter came again, stronger this time. And Frank Carson, tough old rancher who'd faced droughts and frosts and financial ruin without flinching, burst into tears for the second time in a month. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. "Never thought I deserved it." "You deserve everything good, Frank. Everything." They held each other by the fire while snow fell outside, and Frank made a silent promise to whatever God was listening. He would protect this family. He would cherish this woman. He would never ever take a single moment for granted. January brought the coldest temperatures anyone could remember. The creek froze solid. Icicles hung from the barn roof like crystal daggers. Frank spent most of his time keeping the animals fed and the fire stoked, venturing outside only when necessary. But the cold also brought visitors. Reverend Thomas stopped by with a basket of preserves his wife had put up. Margaret Wilson came with baby clothes she'd been knitting for months. Even Mrs. Henderson appeared one afternoon with a pot of chicken soup and an expression that might have been genuine warmth. "For the mother-to-be," she said, thrusting the pot into Frank's hands. "Make sure she eats. She's eating for two now." "I will, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you." She nodded sharply and left. But Frank saw the tears in her eyes before she turned away. "She's lonely," Ethel said when he told her. "Lost her husband, never had children. I think seeing us, seeing what we have, it hurts her. But it also gives her hope." "Hope for what?" "That it's never too late. For love, for family, for second chances." Frank thought about that for a long time. He'd been given a second chance. A chance he'd never expected, never asked for, never believed he deserved. And it had changed everything. February thawed slowly into March. The snow melted, the creek rose, the ground softened in preparation for planting. And Ethel grew larger by the day, her pregnancy now impossible to hide. Dr. Harris visited weekly, checking on mother and baby. "Everything looks good," he said after his latest examination. "The baby's positioned well. Strong heartbeat. Shouldn't be long now." "How long?" Frank asked. "April, probably. Maybe late March if the baby's eager." April, planting season. Frank looked at Ethel, worry creasing his forehead. "Don't even think about it," she said. "Think about what?" "About postponing the planting because of me. The fields need to be worked on schedule. I'll be fine." "Ethel." "I'll be fine, Frank." She took his hand. "We've got neighbors now, friends, people who'll help. You don't have to do everything alone anymore. Remember?" He remembered. But letting go of that old habit was harder than he'd expected. Billy Tanner started work at the ranch in mid-March. He was a good kid, strong, eager, quick to learn. Frank taught him how to hitch the team, how to check the plow, how to read the soil. Billy absorbed everything like a sponge. "My pa never had land of his own," Billy said one afternoon. "Always worked for other folks. I want to be different, want to build something." "That's a good dream, son." "You think I can do it?" Frank looked at the boy, 16 years old, fire in his eyes, hunger in his heart. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to, long as you're willing to work for it." Billy grinned. "I'm willing, Mr. Carson. I surely am." Frank smiled. "Good. Now let's get these furrows straight." They worked until sunset, man and boy planting seeds in soil that had nearly been Frank's grave. And with every row they finished, Frank felt the past loosening its grip. The labor pains started on a Thursday. Frank was in the field with Billy when Margaret Wilson came riding up her horse, lathered and blowing. "It's time," she said. "Ethel sent me to fetch you." Frank dropped his plow and ran. He burst into the cabin to find Ethel in the bedroom, Dr. Harris already at her side. Her face was slick with sweat, her jaw clenched against the pain. "Frank." She reached for his hand. "You came." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." The labor was long and hard. Hours passed, the sun set, candles were lit. Frank held Ethel's hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement, praying silently. "You're doing so well," he said. "You're the strongest person I know." "I don't feel strong." "You are. You're extraordinary." Around midnight, Dr. Harris looked up. "One more push, Mrs. Carson. Give me everything you've got." Ethel screamed. Frank felt her hand crush his fingers. And then a cry, high and thin and beautiful. "It's a girl," Dr. Harris said, holding up the squalling infant. "A healthy baby girl." Frank stared at his daughter. She was red-faced and furious, her tiny fists waving in the air. She had a shock of dark hair and her mother's determined chin. She was perfect. "Hello," Frank whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Hello, Sarah." They named her Sarah James Carson. Sarah for Frank's mother. James for Ethel's first husband. Carson because she was theirs, completely miraculously theirs. The whole territory came to see her. Tom Bradley brought a wooden rocking horse he'd carved himself. The Dawsons came with a quilt Mary had stitched. Even Mrs. Henderson returned this time with a beautiful christening gown that had belonged to her own mother. "Every baby needs something old," she said, pressing it into Ethel's hands. "For luck." "Thank you," Ethel said. "This means more than you know." Mrs. Henderson nodded stiffly, but she stayed for an hour holding Sarah and cooing at her in a voice no one had ever heard her use. People could change. Frank had learned that lesson well. Spring came in full force. The wheat sprouted in the fields, James Mitchell's seed planted by Frank's hands, tended by Billy's labor. The crop promised to be even better than last year's if the weather held, but Frank barely noticed. He was too busy watching his daughter grow. Sarah changed every day. Her dark hair turned lighter. Her eyes, initially blue, deepened to hazel. She learned to smile, to laugh, to reach for her father's face with tiny grasping fingers. "She's got you wrapped around her finger," Ethel said one evening, watching Frank rock Sarah to sleep. "Completely. You know she's going to be trouble when she's older." "Completely. And you don't care at all." "Not even a little bit." Ethel laughed and kissed his cheek. "Me neither." June arrived with heat and sunshine. The wheat grew tall and golden, swaying in the breeze. Frank walked the rows every morning, just as he had the year before. But now he carried Sarah on his hip, showing her the land that would someday be hers. "This is your inheritance," he told her. "Not just the land, the legacy, the love." Sarah gurgled and grabbed at a wheat stalk. Frank laughed. "That's my girl." On the anniversary of Ethel's arrival at his ranch, Frank planned a surprise. He sent Billy to town for supplies. He asked Margaret to take Sarah for the afternoon. He told Ethel to dress nicely because they were going somewhere special. "Where?" she asked suspiciously. "You'll see." He took her to the North Field, the section where they'd lost 8 acres to frost. The section that had once represented failure. But it didn't look like failure now. Frank had cleared the dead stalks over the winter. In their place, he'd planted something different. Roses. Dozens of them blooming red and pink and white in the summer sun. "Frank," Ethel's hand flew to her mouth. "When did you—" "Been working on it since February. Wanted to surprise you." "But why roses? We could have planted more wheat." "We've got enough wheat." Frank took her hands. "This is something else. This is where we almost lost everything. Where we fought the frost together. Where we decided we didn't want to wait anymore." Ethel's eyes glistened. "I remember. I wanted to mark it, to make something beautiful out of something painful." He pulled her close. "That's what you did for me, Ethel. You took my failure and turned it into something beautiful." She kissed him long and deep, surrounded by roses and golden wheat, and the life they'd built together. And Frank Carson, who had spent 13 years alone, finally understood what it meant to be home. The harvest that year was the best in memory. 500 bushels of premium wheat, plus enough seed saved to plant twice the acreage next spring. Tom Bradley bought 100 bushels for distribution to other farmers. The Dawsons bought 50 for their own fields. James Mitchell's legacy was spreading just as Ethel had hoped. And at the center of it all stood Frank and Ethel Carson, their daughter in their arms, their future bright before them. Happy? Ethel asked one evening watching the sunset paint their fields in gold. More than I ever thought possible. No regrets. Only that I wasted so many years alone. Frank looked at her, at Sarah, at the land, and the life they'd created together. But maybe those years weren't wasted. Maybe they were preparing me, making me ready for you. Maybe they were. Either way, I'm grateful. For the bad seed that brought you here. For the frost that brought us together. For every struggle that led to this moment. Ethel leaned against him, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her arms. James used to say that the best soil was made from broken things, dead leaves, old roots, things that seemed worthless until they became the foundation for new growth. Smart man. He was. She smiled. But so are you. They stood together in the fading light, a family forged from loss and hope and stubborn love. Frank had thought he needed to stand alone to prove his worth. Ethel had taught him different. The strongest foundations were built together. Accepting help was courage, not weakness. And the best legacy wasn't what you kept, it was what you planted and let grow. Frank Carson had planted seeds in spring. By autumn, he'd harvested more than grain. He'd harvested a future golden and abundant and shared. And that was worth more than all the wheat in the world.